Okay, on my watch at least it's 1:10. So therefore I would start to introduce the next talk. So welcome back to those who are still in the Zoom, and welcome to those who just joined the Zoom. I would like to shortly introduce the next two speakers of the next talk, Professor Dr. Ian Boardley and Martin Chandler. Ian Boardley is professor in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Birmingham and the lead of the Respect-P project, as he already mentioned within the welcome. His predominant research focus has been on the psychological processes that facilitate the use of image and performance-enhancing drugs in sport and exercise. Next to him, so the second speaker of the next talk, Martin Chandler, is a research fellow at the University of Birmingham and recently submitted his PhD thesis, so fingers crossed, Martin, examining the effects of permitted forms of performance enhancement on determinants of doping. Also being part of the Respect team within the last project. Both together, they will present findings from a Delphi poll focusing on the specific needs of athlete support personnel and para-athletes in clean sport education. So I immediately hand over to both of you. I think, Ian, you're going to share the screen. And for the rest of the audience, enjoy the next talk and the first insights of the project.
Oh, there we go. See. You see that okay now? There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully you can all see that now. It put me in presenter mode for some reason, which meant you couldn't see it correctly. There we go. Okay, so yeah, welcome back, everyone. It's great to see so many people on the call for the keynote earlier, and hopefully everyone enjoyed that. And thanks for the introduction, Bertrand. As Bert just mentioned, Martin and I are now going to present one of the work packages from the Respect-P projects, in which we run what is known as a Delphi poll. So it basically uses expert opinion to answer questions that are very difficult to answer through normal research methods. So we gather opinion and try to establish consensus on a particular issue. And what we're interested in establishing consensus on here was the unique needs for clean sport education for para-athletes and athlete support personnel, because as I mentioned earlier, they're the two groups that we're particularly interested in supporting through this project. So what we're going to take you through today is just some of the methods, but also some of the main findings. The Delphi process is an iterative process, so it usually involves sort of 3 or 4 different rounds. So we'll give you a summary of each of the findings from each of the rounds, and that will ultimately lead us to sort of consensus around this. And certainly the last round, the round 4 results are very hot off the press, you might say. Martin's been working on them this week, but more on that a little bit later. So just to give you a bit more background, yeah, so I mentioned that it's the Delphi process is guided by the opinion of world-leading experts. So because you're trying to establish a consensus around a very difficult to understand topic, you need to make sure that you recruit the right people, that you're getting the opinions of the right people. So Marty will give you details on our actual expert panel, but what we were looking to do is recruit experts from across, particularly anti-doping, but also some of the other integrity issues that have been raised in the project relating to parasport, so that we've got representation across those different groups in our expert panel. But yeah, really what we wanted to establish was the educational needs. But what also became apparent early in the project was that wasn't just that there was this separation between some of the suggested content that would go into education, but also the design and the delivery, and how that might need to be, at least in some cases, bespoke for para-athletes and for athlete support personnel compared to what is traditionally being delivered to date. So hopefully that'll be something, you know, of real interest to many of the practitioners on the call. So I'll hand over to Martin now. Martin's going to take you through the methods in a little bit more detail. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you for that, Ian. Okay, so as Ian described, this is an iterative process. We have several rounds. Typically, when we've done this in the past, the Delphi survey uses 3 rounds. For this one, we had to add an extra round because it's a complex subject. The first round is usually the first round usually involves taking sort of elements from other work packages, which we did in this case, and using those to develop a series of recommendations or a series of items that you want to share with your expert group. In this case, we wanted to add in some more expert opinion. So when we started recruiting our expert panel and understanding their background in parasport, we also asked them for some input so that we could develop the next round. So as you can see on the slide, we incorporated findings from the other work packages. These were primarily qualitative packages, so interviews with athletes and athlete support personnel, so para-athletes and athlete support personnel, trying to determine kind of what the key things were that they felt that they needed within clean sport education. We started recruiting experts. We had set criteria for it. There were some challenges around this because obviously people can work in several different roles all at the same time. So there were times when we had to kind of look through somebody's background and see whether or not they kind of met our criteria, because they cumulatively across their many different roles. We ended up with a great panel. There were, again, some challenges around some specific areas. There are some very niche areas in parasport that can be very difficult to get expertise or expert input on, particularly things around equipment manipulation, for instance. There are very few people working in that field. We developed our first survey, well, this would actually be round 2, which I'll talk about in a second. Based on the recommendations from, or the input from the experts within round 1, and from the qualitative research that we got in the other work packages. So just, you know, kind of a brief background of the expert panel that we recruited. You can see kind of broadly some gender distribution and age distribution. There you go. So I'm pointing at my assistant here. Primarily, a lot of our experts come from an academic or NADO background, but we did manage to get a reasonable representation across other roles: sport governance, sport federations, athlete support personnel, some athlete researchers. But perhaps not surprisingly, the great majority of the people who were inputting this were people working in research or working in practice within the role. And again, this is a European project, so perhaps not surprising that the vast majority of our panel come from Europe, but we did seek to try and get global input, partly because the recommendations that we'd like to make should be available to people everywhere working in parasport, but also because there are some areas of expertise, particularly things like equipment manipulation again, or the kind of equipment design, where we had to go outside of Europe to find some people that could really provide the kind of input that we needed. So some of the key things that came out through the qualitative work with para-athletes in particular, but also athlete support personnel, was that whilst we set out originally looking at anti-doping, education. There were a number of things that came through that weren't anti-doping or weren't within the, the realm of doping, but still came across as being needed to be talked about within clean sport education. And there were also elements that were not content so much, but more about how the education would be delivered, particularly with reference to para athletes who may have some challenges with kind of, you know, just PowerPoints or kind of other traditional forms of education delivery. So I'll talk through some of these now, but broadly, the survey structure ended up with these three kind of overarching sections, and then each section was divided between para athletes and athlete support personnel. So this was so round two. We delivered or we sent out a list of items that were had been suggested through the qualitative work and through the kind of expert input in round one. And we asked people to rate how important they thought these items were in terms of clean sport education. So, for instance, if you look at the anti-doping clean sport education for para athletes over on the left-hand side of the screen there, you'll notice that these importance ratings are out of 5, and as you can see, there isn't much variation there. So people felt that broadly they were all quite important, so it became quite difficult to distinguish between them. Part of the process here is to try and weed out things that people don't think are very important, but obviously couldn't really do that here, except for one item, the input from athletes with ADRVs talking about their own experience. That was not a popular item generally within the within this round of the survey. If we move on to next slide. So this was the same process again, but for athlete support personnel. And again, there isn't a huge amount of variation in there, but there is highlighting some of the things that turned up in the non-doping clean sport education. So in particular, the two kind of key issues that really came out, particularly in the qualitative work, and you'll probably hear this through the rest of the next today and tomorrow, classification. So issues around classification and around classificational manipulation or intentional misrepresentation of classification, and boosting, which is a very niche area. It only really affects a particular group of para athletes, but it was highlighted as something that just isn't spoken about really within the context of clean sport a great deal. And for para athletes, a very strong message came through that this was a much bigger issue for them from their perspective than doping. And then we moved into the education, design and delivery. And again, this was a big issue, particularly for para athletes, because a lot of, like in some places, for instance, a lot of anti-doping education or clean sport education is delivered online, for instance, which may not be entirely appropriate for some people who need screen readers or people who need braille, or and the delivery and the design and delivery of these materials in a format and a manner that was accessible for para athletes was came through very strongly as something that really needed to be addressed within clean sport education. So, but again, as you can see here, there isn't a lot of variation in the importance rating. So again, people seem to be saying, well, all of these things are important. So the next stage of the process is to try and work out some way of kind of discriminating between these items. So the next stage was to talk about, to get our participants to rank the items in order, in what they felt was the order of importance. So Ian's going to talk about round 3 and round 4, where we start to kind of get a bit more consensus from our expert panel.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so as Martin's clearly shown there, and also the results that you could see from the from round 2, there was a lot of the experts were rating almost every item very highly. You see by the high mean scores. But what we also did, and we're not presenting today for time, but we also each round asked for qualitative feedback from the experts as well. And an important aspect of that related to this, there was several experts in the qualitative comments that said these things are all important. I don't, these are all vibes. They're all important. They all need to be included. So we took that into account when we went into this next stage where we wanted people to rank them, because what we can do now, we're asking people to rank them in comparison to each other, so we can actually identify which are the highest priority ones. But we had to recognize that some people were probably not comfortable doing that because they felt that everything was important that we were asking. So we asked people to rank them, but then they could indicate whether they felt that everything was equal importance. Given limitless resources, do you think all of these things would be of equal importance? And I think there's roughly around about a third. It obviously varied across different areas, but roughly a third was saying that for the different areas. So there's obviously a strong feeling that these are important things to address. But what this round 3 has allowed us to do, obviously, is identify across the group which of the items are the ones that are seen as highest priority. So a lower ranking score, so 1 would be the highest importance. So down towards the bottom of the ones you can see here for the anti-doping clean sport education for para athletes, which the experts were saying the most important. So the most highly ranked was the tailored education content for para athletes with particular issues for the doping control process, highlighting the aspects relevant to their needs. So that was felt to be really important, and it is also come through in some of the qualitative work as well. That it's important to that athletes are educated around what the requirements are, but also what the support is during the doping control process. Because as you can see just above that, it's also talking about athletes' rights during the doping control process, and very similar mean rankings for those 2 items. The one that was seen, you see at the other end at the top of the screen, the input from athletes with ADRVs on their experience story. While that when we're asking them to rate the importance in isolation, that scored quite high. When they were asked to rank against the others, that one was seen as less important, and therefore we would class that as lower priority if we're having to choose between them. So if we move on to the non-doping aspects, so these are ones that Marty was mentioning, that generally around classification and boosting. We can see that details of the classification process for para athletes are particularly important. So that quite clearly had it was ranked as most important. So how it happens, who's responsible, and what's going to happen, so they're made clear. And then the next one related to intentional misrepresentation as well. So in general, what we're seeing, and again, this is reinforced in our qualitative work, is that these issues around the classification process and intentional misrepresentation are quite major issues for para athletes. Boosting is obviously important, but as Martin pointed out, it only affects a subset of para athletes, so that might explain why we're seeing that as being ranked a bit lower. And then if we move on to the ASP, we can see it's the how to manage the risks of medication and supplement use by athletes. So medication, obviously, especially if you're working with para athletes, we tend to have a great need for medication, but also supplement use generally for athletes, and being able to advise basically to try and minimize the risk of inadvertent doping was seen as being particularly important for athlete support personnel. And again, I think we'll see in the other presentations that's come through as a strong theme in the interviews as well. Roles and responsibilities of athlete support personnel in preventing anti-doping in sport was also seen as high on the rankings. And then at the other end of the scale, we've got the role of specific ASP. So this was asking about, rather than looking at ASP generally, looking at specific ones and what their specific roles might be. That was seen as perhaps less important than actually the generic roles and responsibilities of ASP. And then again with the athlete support personnel, but now with the non-doping education, we can see that there's some distinction here. Obviously, we've got fewer aspects in here, but it's the role of specific athlete support personnel in the classification process. Again, is being ranked. You know, the things relevant to classification have been ranked higher and of greater importance than ones around boosting and autonomic dyslexia. So as we see again here. And then if we move on to look at the design and delivery, probably less, certainly for this one, less distinction, but still some quite marked differences between the ones that are highest importance. So educational materials provided in multiple formats to meet varying disability needs. So for para athletes, this is seen as being extremely important. And for anyone that hasn't seen the recordings of the from the first multiplier event led by UK Anti-Doping, which was in June in Birmingham, they're available on our YouTube channel. And one of those, I think it's session 9, was a specific session on how you can deliver education depending on people's needs. So it highlights the importance of that. So, those sort of considerations. So it's worth taking a look at that if you've not seen it, because obviously the experts are rating this as being of particular importance here. And then equally important was the anti-doping education provided early as possible in a para-athlete's career. This relates to some of the qualitative comments as well that we received, but also in the other work packages. There's this feeling that within parasport that there's often a much faster, a sharper trajectory in people's careers. So people can move from being at a lower level of the sport up to the elite level very quickly. So there's often risk that people are getting into a situation where they're being tested and not received education, or they're in risk environments and they're not had education. So highlighting the need to try as much as possible to start it early in their career. At the other end of the scale was the contribution from medical experts with experience in parasport in education development for para-athletes. That was seen, particularly around therapeutic use exemptions, that was seen as the lowest importance. And then if we look at design and delivery for athlete support personnel, the two aspects that we had in there were seen as being equally important. So it's increase the inclusion of interactive education programs, so different modes of delivery. And again, this comes through in other elements of our work to show that athlete support personnel often like different modes of delivery of education, some that match what you're trying to achieve in the learning outcomes, but also just a variety of delivery is probably more engaging for the recipient as well. And then including the voice of experienced athlete support personnel in development of clean sport education. I think most people on the call would probably agree that that's that it's very important that it certainly matches with one of the main philosophies in the way that we operate with Respect P, in that we're collaborating with practitioners throughout. And what this is saying is that we need to be working with and collaborating with athlete support personnel when we're developing education materials to make them most relevant and suitable for them. Okay, so so moving on to this is preparation for round 4. I'm not going to go through these two slides. It's just to illustrate to you what we then presented in round 4 to the experts. So based on those rankings, what we've done, we've identified where we've got sort of separation in those rankings to categorize different items into high priority, medium priority, and low priority. And then we presented this to the expert panel and asked them how much agreement there was around this, to see that to ensure that we've established consensus around these being key areas for support, but which ones are the greatest priority. So we had this one for the para athletes, and then we've got an equivalent one, but obviously with slightly fewer items on there, but still separating. And where we've got only a small number of items, then nothing needs to be low priority in there. And this is for the athlete support personnel. So just to sort of move on to the results from round 4, once these have been presented to the expert panel, and I say this is hot off the press, we'll probably still get 1 or 2 more responses in this. So this is sort of live data. So it might change slightly, but I don't think this consensus is going to change hugely now, because there's probably not enough experts left that haven't contributed. But in terms of the one we presented for the para athletes, we've got 26 of 27 that have responded so far that have either said they fully accept the guidelines or recommendations, or they accept them with minor changes. So obviously, we said that there's 1 or 2 people that wanted everything to be of equal importance. So it might be that we've got some. So if we go through the qualitative comments, I suspect that's probably going to be where we've got some suggestions for amendment. But I would see that as being a good level of consensus around those recommendations. And then if we look at the athlete support personnel, it's even more towards the accept fully. Obviously, what we do see is that there's 1 or 2 people that would want more significant changes towards the right there. Not many. We've still got a good level of consensus with 23 of the 27 saying they either fully or accept with minor changes. Well, obviously the qualitative comments, when we got all the data in, will be really helpful for us to understand what some of the people that have said accept partly or do not accept might have concerns around. So I think that's all the main findings we wanted to present. I think just to sort of summarize and conclude, what we also did was so we obviously identified 12 aspects of content and 6 aspects of design delivery for para athletes that are all considered to be important, and then we've ranked those by priority, and it's 7 and 2 for the athlete support personnel. In this last round, we're starting to see now that we've got good consensus around that, which means this will probably be the final round of the exercise, which is really good. And then what we can then do is start to try and influence policy. We've also asked experts in the qualitative comments to suggest some of the policies that could be influenced. Obviously, what's slightly tricky in some of the comments that are coming back relate to, particularly the non-doping aspects, because quite often a lot of the people that are delivering clean sport education at the moment don't really have a background in delivering that. But we are seeing some organizations move more towards being integrity bodies. So we are seeing more people that have got that knowledge. But from our experience with speaking with practitioners today, there's a definite interest in understanding areas such as classification and boosting, because when you deliver education to para athletes, those questions come up, because as we'll see from the other work packages, clean sport is seen as being much more about integrity and not just doping with para athletes, as we saw with the previous projects with non-disabled athletes. So what we want to seek to do now is try to influence policy to try and ensure that more of some of these guidelines are adopted, and we can see improvements in education for para athletes and athlete support personnel. Another thing that's been raised by in the qualitative comments relates to the resources, and saying where will the resource come for this. But I think what we need to do is try and obviously lobby for that, because we're seeing that the expert panel are making the case that these are important considerations, and we know from presentation that I mentioned of UCAD that some NADOs are already considering these factors and incorporating in their delivery. So we just need to try and make sure that everyone is in a position to do that, to make sure that we're getting this education presented specific to parasport, but also considering the specific needs of athlete support personnel. So that's the end of the main presentation, but I think we've got some time for any questions that members of the audience might have through the chat, or if anyone wants to actually speak, ask questions. Dennis, yeah.
Okay, I'll go for the icebreaker again. So in the very end, you said that many persons within the ASPs were pretty open for taking part in educational programs for instance, the classification and so on. Do you already have an idea how we can systematically include them directly into these education programs, how they can be a more important and longer part in that?
I think, I mean, there are two ways of approaching this. So obviously the IPC could try to ensure this education of delivered to people delivering education, to ensure that they have the knowledge around classification and boosting. So it could be the ICP that could take that, IPC could take that on and take that forward. But it could also be incorporated within education of anti-doping practitioners. And I know that might, I think to some people that sounds a little bit strange, but I'm not sure, you know, when you speak to actual practitioners, they're saying that these questions do come up and they want to be in a position where they can answer those questions. So for me, it probably makes sense for it to be part of the development of or a bespoke additional education session for people delivering anti-doping education, so that when they're delivering education to para-athletes, that they have that knowledge. And there are practitioners who specialize, and we'll hear from one of them tomorrow, in delivering education within parasport. So I would imagine, as we might hear tomorrow, that for those people, they'll have a great deal of knowledge that could be transmitted. So there could be something that we could do there in terms of educating, you know, disseminating that knowledge that's being developed. But it'll also be interesting to hear tomorrow to sort of hear about how that education's been, how that knowledge base has been developed as well. But yeah, I think those are the two main routes that we could approach that through.
Thank you.
There is another question in the chat. May you please refer to, have there been any athlete perspectives?
So yeah, so it's obviously a good question and something that's very important to us. And thankfully, I'm happy to say yes, because it wouldn't be good if we hadn't. So a couple of routes. So in terms of our expert criteria, athletes were involved, but they had to have some knowledge and background in research as well. So it meant that on the actual panel, there wasn't as much representation as we'd perhaps like, but it's quite specialist knowledge that was required. But the way we've got the athlete voice in very strongly, and that of athlete support personnel, is what Martin mentioned earlier on in terms of those earlier work packages. So a lot of the themes that we, as well as round one, establishing some of those items and themes through the expert opinion, we also had the findings from past research, which is work package 2, but then work package 3 and 4 was where the athlete support personnel and the athlete voice came through. And it was the themes that were coming through from those work packages that fed into the development of the items for the round 2 survey.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you within the chat. And maybe last one more on a practical side, I would say, due to the time already running. Where is it possible to find your research? Maybe important for more than one person.
So the research today, if you just do a search on the web, then you'll find the references. I've got a research portal on the University of Birmingham website. But for this project, this study in particular, we're writing it up as we speak, and as soon as we have a finalized draft and it's ready to submit for publication, we'll also put it on a preprint server. So that means it's publicly accessible. It won't be behind a paywall. And what we can also do is make sure that everyone that registered for the event over these 2 days will receive a link to that. So yeah, we'll make sure that everyone gets a link to that once it's ready.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, Martin, for presenting the first insight of the project.